I knew something was terribly wrong the moment I turned onto the gravel road leading to my grandfather's lakeside cabin. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the pines, casting golden streaks across the windshield, and all I could think about was a glass of wine and silence. Instead, my eyes landed on a moving truck, parked in my driveway. I hit the brakes hard. My stomach dropped. Cardboard boxes were scattered across the porch. A blue car with a baby on board sticker was parked beside it. Through the window, I spotted a woman, heavily pregnant, humming softly as she taped animal decals to the freshly painted nursery wall. My name is Allison Hart. I'm 31, a senior creative director in Chicago, and I inherited this cabin 6 months ago after my grandfather passed. It was meant to be my sanctuary, my escape. No one, absolutely no one was supposed to be here. And yet, someone had moved in without permission, without my knowledge. As I stood frozen behind the wheel, heart hammering, one horrifying thought echoed in my mind. Did Thomas do this? The cabin wasn't just a building, it was the thread that stitched my childhood summers together. Grandpa Lou built it himself in the 1960s, a humble two-bedroom lodge nestled at the edge of Blue Pine Lake in northern Wisconsin. It smelled like cedar and old books, and every creaky floorboard had a story. That place wasn't just where I learned to bait a hook or build a fire. It's where I became who I am. When my parents divorced, I was just 8 years old, confused, angry, lost. Mom worked 2 jobs in the city, and my sister Elise and I would spend every summer with Grandpa Lou. Elise always preferred the town library or tagging along with the neighbors' girls, but I craved the stillness of the woods, the splash of oars on water, the way Grandpa's stories wove magic into ordinary moments. Nature doesn't judge, he once told me as we sat on the edge of the dock watching the sun melt into the lake. It just listens. That's why this place matters. By the time I hit high school and the panic attacks started, the cabin became more than a summer retreat. It was my therapy. Grandpa taught me breathing exercises, took me for long canoe rides when I couldn't sleep, and listened without judgment when I broke down over grades or boys or my uncertain future. At 17, when I confessed I didn't want to follow the family path into law, he just nodded and said, "Then don't. Build your own life. I'll be proud no matter what." I did. I went into marketing, moved to Chicago, built a career. But I never missed a summer at the cabin. Even as work demands grew, I carved out time at least one long weekend each month to be with Grandpa. As he aged, I noticed how he slowed down. His hands shook a little, his stories repeated, but his mind remained sharp. Then, 3 years ago, he was diagnosed with congestive heart failure. It hit hard. The family rallied. Mom visited often. Elise came when she could. But I took a leave of absence and moved into his main house in Wauwatosa to care for him full time during his last year. That's when Thomas started sniffing around the cabin. Thomas, Elise's husband of 6 years, had always been polite enough, a little smug, always networking, always on the phone, even during Christmas dinners. When he learned the cabin was Grandpa Lou's only unmortgaged property, he made little comments like, Elise and I have always dreamed of raising a kid in a place like this, or that dock would be great for teaching a kid to fish. At first, I brushed it off. We were all dealing with grief in our own way, but the comments became more frequent and more pointed. Family should share family property, he said once over dinner. Otherwise, what's the point of legacy? I did invite. Grandpa hadn't yet updated his will, and I wasn't going to assume anything. My priority was making sure he was comfortable, loved, and never alone. 2 months before he passed, Grandpa called a meeting with his attorney. I remember sitting in his living room, the place quiet except for the ticking clock, He looked each of us in the eyes, then read the updated will aloud. I've thought carefully about this, he said. The main house will be sold. Proceeds split equally among my children and grandkids. The cabin, however, will go solely to Allison. There was a long silence. Elise looked surprised, but she didn't protest. Makes sense, she said. Allie's the one who spent the most time with him there. But Thomas? His jaw tightened. He forced a smile, congratulated me. But I knew. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not disappointment, ownership. After Grandpa's funeral, Thomas cornered me near the hors d'oeuvres table. So, summer plans? Elise and I were thinking July would be great to bring the baby up. You're not expecting yet, I said. He shrugged. Soon, hopefully. Either way, you won't be using the place every weekend. We could set up a rotation. Fair use. It's not a timeshare, Thomas, I said calmly. It's my home now. He didn't respond, but I saw it in his eyes, a calculation. That was the moment I realized he wouldn't let this go. The weeks that followed Grandpa's funeral were a blur of work deadlines and grief. I buried myself in client pitches and branding proposals, using busyness as a distraction. But even as I tried to move forward, Thomas lingered, like a shadow at the edge of everything. He texted casually, "Any chance we could use the cabin for Memorial Day?" Or, "Heard the fishing's good this month, mind if I take a few friends up?" Always worded politely, as though we were sharing a rental property. I always replied with some version of, "Not a good time," or, "I'm planning to go up that weekend." But the truth was, I just didn't want him there. He was persistent. You work in the city, the place is sitting empty most of the time. Doesn't seem right. Or worse, you're single, Ali. You don't need all that space. The implication stung, as if my relationship status determined whether I deserved peace and privacy. Elise, bless her, tried to mediate. He just misses Grandpa, she said one afternoon over coffee. The cabin feels like family to him, too. But I knew better. It wasn't about nostalgia. It was about possession. The final straw came when I received a forwarded email from our family group chain. Thomas had sent a message with the subject, "Family Cabin Calendar Proposal." Attached was a color-cased spreadsheet outlining who could use the cabin, when, and for how long. My name had been penciled in for 2 weeks in June, 2 in September. I stared at the screen in disbelief. No one had asked me. No one had checked in. And yet here it was, my private sanctuary reduced to a community resource. I replied with a single sentence. The cabin is private property and not available for shared scheduling. Thomas didn't respond, but the silence didn't last long. A week later, I ran into him at Elisa's birthday dinner. He pulled me aside near the wine bar, his tone low but tight. "You didn't have to embarrass me like that," he said. "I didn't mean to embarrass you. I meant to set a boundary." "You're being selfish," he snapped. "You inherited something that should have gone to the family. Don't pretend like it was earned." The words stung more than I expected. It wasn't just entitlement. It was resentment. I'd always suspected Thomas saw me as some city slicker career woman playing dress up with nature, but now it was out in the open. He didn't think I deserved it. I left the party early. After that, things escalated. Packages started arriving at the cabin addressed to Thomas Taylor. Utility company emails began trickling into my inbox, showing requests for service name changes. I called the providers, had the requests canceled, but the sense of violation lingered. One evening, while reviewing my security camera footage from the smart system Grandpa and I had installed, I saw a clip that made my skin crawl. Thomas walking around the porch, measuring windows, phone in hand. He didn't break in, didn't touch anything, but he was casing the place, like he was preparing for something. I saved the footage, forwarded it to my lawyer with the message, "Am I being paranoid?" Her response was swift. "No, keep everything. We may need it." I started sleeping with my phone on loud. I began journaling each interaction. I warned my neighbors at the lake, but deep down, I feared this was just the beginning. That fear was confirmed 2 weeks later when I received a call from a realtor in the area. "Hi, Miss Hart," she said politely. "This is Clara from Lakefront Realty. Just confirming your listing for the cabin went live this morning. We already have 2 interested buyers." I blinked. "What listing?" She hesitated. "The one submitted last Thursday. Thomas Taylor provided the documentation, said he was handling the sale on behalf of the family trust." I nearly dropped the phone. My hands trembled as I explained that I had never authorized a sale, nor had I appointed anyone to represent me. The listing was taken down immediately, and Clara promised to flag Thomas's name if he ever contacted them again. But that day, I sat in my office for nearly an hour, shaking. He had tried to sell my property, not ask for access, not borrow it, sell it. That wasn't ignorance or entitlement. That was calculated overreach, a direct threat. I knew then that I needed to do more than just set boundaries. I had to defend them because if I didn't, someone like Thomas would bulldoze right through. It was a Thursday afternoon when my phone rang in the middle of a client presentation. I almost ignored it until I saw Elise's name. I stepped out into the hallway and answered, expecting a casual update or family chat. What I heard instead made the room spin. "Allison," Elise said, her voice tight with emotion, "Thomas and I split up 3 weeks ago." I paused. "Wait, what?" "It's complicated," she sighed. "I didn't want to burden you, especially after everything with Grandpa, but he was seeing someone else. Her name's Emily. She's 7 months pregnant." I leaned against the wall, trying to process. "Since when?" "They've been involved for almost a year. I found out when she called me by accident, thinking Thomas had already told me about her. He hadn't." My stomach dropped. Thomas had been lying to Elise, cheating on her while Grandpa was dying, and now had a pregnant girlfriend? "There's more," Elise continued. "Emily told me they're moving. Somewhere rural, quiet. A cabin," she said. They froze. "Elise?" I whispered. "They're moving into my cabin." There was silence on the line. I told him no, Elise, multiple times. I've denied every request. I never gave him permission to be there. "Oh my God," she breathed. "Emily said you offered, that you were thrilled to help them." I was already pulling up my security app, my hands shaking. The feed connected, and there it was. A U-Haul truck in the driveway, boxes on the porch, a baby mobile dangling from the ceiling inside my reading nook. I felt sick. I ended the call and immediately started the drive north. I didn't stop for coffee. I didn't even tell Elise goodbye. My thoughts spiraled the entire way. How long had he planned this? Had he changed the locks? Forwarded mail? When I arrived, it was dusk. The sky was bruised pink and purple, but my chest burned. I parked behind the moving truck, blocking it in. Every inch of the cabin screamed invasion. The porch was cluttered with unfamiliar items, baby gear, men's jackets, a box labeled Emily's kitchen. My key still worked. I stepped inside. The house smelt like new paint and cheap vanilla candles. The walls of my quiet sanctuary had been transformed. My grandfather's fishing rods were pushed into a corner. My rug was gone. A crib stood in what had been my office. From the hallway emerged a very pregnant woman with auburn hair and nervous eyes. "Oh, you must be Allison," she said brightly. "Thomas said you might swing by to help us settle in." I blinked. "I'm Allison. Yes, and this is my cabin. The confusion on her face was instant. Wait, what? Emily, right? I asked, voice flat. What exactly did Thomas tell you? That this is your family's cabin, that you offered it to us, especially with the baby coming. I never offered anything, I said. In fact, I told him repeatedly that he could not come here. Emily's face paled. But we gave up our apartment. He said this was our new start. The front door opened. Thomas entered, whistling, holding a bag of takeout like he'd just gotten home from work. He stopped cold when he saw me. Listen, he said, smile twitching. Didn't expect you till tomorrow. You don't belong here, I said, voice sharp. What are you doing? He set the bag down. Come on, don't make a scene. Let's not upset Emily. I'm not making a scene, I'm making a boundary. Thomas's jaw clenched. You're being unreasonable. We need this place. Emily's pregnant. Where else are we supposed to go? Not my problem, I snapped. You lied. To her, to me, to everyone. He stepped forward, voice lowering. You're going to regret this. Family's supposed to help family. This isn't help. This is theft. Emily backed into the hallway, trembling. Thomas followed her, but not before turning and hissing. We're not leaving. You'll have to drag us out. I took a shaky breath and reached for my phone. Then I guess I'll call someone who can. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You'll really call the cops on a pregnant woman? If she's here under false pretenses, yes. And on the man who lied to her and tried to steal my inheritance. Thomas scoffed. You think a judge will side with you? Single city girl evicting a family in need? Good luck. I ignored him, stepping outside to breathe. My hands trembled, heart racing, rage and disbelief swirling in my chest. I paced around the cabin, snapping photos of the moving truck, the boxes, the nursery setup. I documented everything. Inside, I heard raised voices, Emily crying, Thomas insisting everything was fine. I re-entered and found her sitting on the edge of the bed, tear-streaked, hugging her stomach. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear, Allison, he said you offered the place for a year, that you were happy to help us get on our feet. I knelt a few feet away, giving her space. I believe you. But none of that is true. This is my home. It's not family-owned. It's not shared property. It was left to me alone. Her voice cracked. Where are we supposed to go? I don't have anywhere else. The truth hit me then. Emily wasn't the villain. She was just another victim of Tomas's manipulations. I glanced around. You're not safe here. Not like this. He's using both of us. Thomas stormed back in. Enough. We're staying. I've already set up mail forwarding. Utilities are in my name. That makes us residents. I stood. It makes you a fraud. He moved closer, lowering his voice into a threat. You push this. You'll regret it. Emily's due soon. You really want the family talking about how heartless you are? How you threw a pregnant woman out into the street? The sheer audacity made my vision tunnel. You have 24 hours to vacate, I said, cold and steady, or I'm calling the sheriff. Your choice. He sneered. Go ahead. We're not going anywhere. That night, I sat in my locked car, hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying not to cry. The cabin, the one place that had always felt safe, was no longer mine, at least not in spirit. It had been invaded, defiled, claimed by someone who believed his needs outweighed my rights. I called Lauren, my best friend since college, who answered on the second ring. He's moved in, I said, voice barely above a whisper, with her, with their baby stuff. He told her I offered the place to them, and now he's refusing to leave. Oh my God, Allie, she breathed. That's not just manipulative. That's illegal. You need to call the police. I know, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat, but he is counting on the optics. pregnant woman, evil city sister, family inheritance. He's weaponizing decency. Lauren's voice sharpened. Then you stop playing nice. Document everything. Take photos. Record if your state allows. And sleep somewhere else tonight. But if I leave them there, you are not responsible for their lies. You're not abandoning anything. You're protecting yourself. I ended the call and drove to the nearest inn, 20 minutes away. I barely slept. I kept thinking about Grandpa Lou's words. Some places have spirit, and wondering how the spirit of the cabin could survive this violation. The next morning, I called a lawyer and the sheriff's non-emergency line. Both said the same thing, gray area. If Thomas had forwarded mail and changed utilities, he could claim partial residence, making this a civil matter. But if I could prove he'd entered without permission, if I had texts, video, written objections, then it became trespassing. I had all three. Sheriff's Deputy Rodriguez agreed to meet me that evening to assess the situation. Until then, I was in limbo. I checked on the cabin from my phone, watched security footage of Thomas lounging on my grandfather's recliner, scrolling his phone like he owned the place. Around noon, I called Elise. "I'm so sorry," she said immediately after I explained. "I should have warned you. I didn't think he'd go this far." "This isn't about the cabin," I said. "It's about control. He didn't get what he wanted from you, so he's taking it from me." Elise was quiet a moment. "He does that. He convinces you that your resistance is selfish, that your boundaries hurt others. But the truth is, he doesn't see people, just pawns." Her words hit hard. I had spent so long trying to be the reasonable one, the peacemaker. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a siege. I returned to the inn, took a long shower, and forced down a sandwich. My stomach twisted with guilt, not because I was wrong, but because I'd been made to feel wrong for defending what was mine. At 6 p.m., I pulled into the cabin driveway alongside Deputy Rodriguez. His presence brought a strange relief. "This ends now," I whispered to myself, stepping out of the car. Tomas came out as we approached, his expression darkening when he saw the deputy. "What's this?" he said sharply. "Mr. Taylor," Rodriguez said evenly, "I'm here regarding a trespassing complaint. Miss Hart is the sole legal owner of this property. She has stated you do not have permission to be here." Thomas spread his hands in mock innocence. "We have a verbal agreement. Emily and I are establishing residency. I changed the mail, set up utilities." Rodriguez held up a hand. "Do you have written proof of consent?" Thomas faltered. "Because Ms. Hart has text messages that explicitly deny your request. You entered anyway." It's trespassing. For the first time, I saw fear in Thomas's eyes. He glanced at Emily, who was peeking from the window, clearly distressed. "You wouldn't arrest a man for trying to protect his family," he said, his tone turning pleading. "That depends," Rodriguez said, calmly. "Are you leaving voluntarily or not?" A long pause. Thomas's shoulders sagged. "Fine, we'll go." It took hours for him to gather their things. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching every box and bag leave my cabin. Emily never looked me in the eye again. She followed him, slow and silent. When the truck finally disappeared down the dirt road, I turned to Rodriguez. "Thank you." He nodded. "Change the locks. Tonight." That night, I sat on the floor of my ransacked living room. My sanctuary had been invaded, but it wasn't broken, not entirely. As I swept up shattered glass from a picture frame, I realized something. I hadn't lost. I'd stood my ground, and that was something Grandpa Lou had been proud of. The next morning, I called the locksmith Deputy Rodriguez had recommended. By noon, every exterior lock had been changed. I installed a new deadbolt on the shed, added motion sensor lights around the porch, and ordered a full security camera system to replace the outdated one. I wasn't just reclaiming my space, I was fortifying it. That weekend, Elise came up to help. She arrived with 2 travel mugs and a bag of pastries from my favorite bakery back home. You didn't have to come, I said as we hugged on the porch. I wanted to, she replied. Omas took a lot from both of us. Let's get some of it back. We spent the next 2 days restoring the cabin. We boxed up the nursery items Thomas had left behind, scrubbed crayon marks off the hallway walls, and repositioned Grandpa Lou's fishing rods back above the fireplace. Every act felt like stitching a wound closed. In the evenings, we sat on the dock with our feet in the water, watching the sun set over Blue Pine Lake, just like Grandpa used to do with me. Elise cried once, quietly, and I didn't say anything. We were both mourning more than just a betrayal. We were mourning the naivety we'd lost. I also reached out to Emily. She had stayed silent throughout the fallout, but I still felt a responsibility. She picked up on the first ring. Allison, she asked cautiously. I just wanted to check if you're okay. There was a long pause. I didn't know, she finally said. Not about the cabin, not about most things. Thomas made everything sound like it was handled. Does that, I replied gently. But you're not alone. If you need help, I can connect you with some women's resource centers nearby. I I like that, she said, voice breaking. I'm not going back to him. I gave her the number for a transitional housing program in Madison and offered to drop off her remaining items. That weekend, I did clothes, kitchenware, a few baby blankets she left behind. She hugged me before I left. You could have hate. You were lied to too, I said, and you did the right thing. That matters. Meanwhile, I met with a lawyer to ensure nothing like this could happen again. We filed a formal trespassing report, sent cease and desist letters, and drafted a written cabin use policy for extended family. Clear rules, no exceptions, no ambiguity. The property was mine. But the responsibility was also mine to protect it and the legacy it carried. By the end of the month, the cabin no longer felt contaminated. It felt clean, safe. And for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. In the following weeks, I began building new routines at the cabin. Mornings started with coffee on the porch swing, wrapped in a flannel blanket as fog drifted across the lake. I bought fresh paint for the living room, soft sage green, and finally framed the black and white photo of Grandpa Lou holding a trout, grinning like a schoolboy. Work, too, began to feel manageable again. I arranged to work remotely part of the month and set up a small office space in the reading nook. My boss supported it, saying, honestly, your focus since all that cabin chaos, impressive. But it wasn't just focus, it was clarity. Each task, each meeting, each email came from a steadier place, the kind of grounding you only get when you reclaim something sacred. One afternoon, while cleaning the storage chest beneath the dock, I found an old leather-bound journal I didn't recognize. Inside, Grandpa Lou had scribbled thoughts about legacy, nature, and family. One entry read, some things must be held by one, not shared by many to preserve their soul. I gave Allison the cabin not because I loved her more, but because I trusted she'd protect its spirit. I sat on the dock for a long time, journal in hand, letting his words anchor me. Rebuilding wasn't just about fixing damage, it was about growing stronger in the process. That evening, I lit a fire in the hearth and cooked one of Grandpa's favorite meals, grilled trout with rosemary potatoes. I played his old vinyl records and let the crackle of jazz and the warmth of the cabin remind me that healing isn't a straight line. It's layered, messy, but possible. Outside, the lake shimmered in moonlight, quiet and still. And for once, I didn't feel haunted by what had happened. I felt home. Thomas didn't go quietly, not really. 2 weeks after he moved out, I received a certified letter from a lawyer claiming I had unlawfully evicted a tenant and demanding compensation for emotional distress and investment in property improvements. I stared at the document, half laughing in disbelief. He had painted himself as a victim in a home he never had legal right to enter. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't confused or doubting myself. I gathered everything: the text messages where I denied him permission, the security footage of him moving in, the sheriff's report, even a witness statement from Emily confirming he had lied to her. My lawyer sent back a rebuttal so strong the firm representing Thomas withdrew within a week. It was the first time in months I felt utterly powerful. I didn't stop there. I upgraded the property insurance, formalized the land deed with a legacy clause, and implemented a system where all family cabin use had to be requested via a notarized form with set dates and terms, no exceptions. Then I wrote a letter to every member of my extended family. I explained what had happened: the manipulation, the lies, the legal battle. I included a copy of Grandpa Lou's journal entry about stewardship and my responsibility. I wrote not out of anger, but clarity. I would not tolerate further pressure or guilt. The cabin was mine, and I would protect it. The responses were mixed. Some cousins were shocked. A few aunts reached out to apologize for ever implying it should be shared. Elise wrote me a long message that ended with, "I wish I'd seen what he was doing sooner, but I'm proud of you. So proud." The rest? Silence. But I didn't care. Silence, for once, meant peace. I poured that same clarity into my job. My team at the agency noticed, clients noticed. By fall, I was promoted to strategy director, given flexible remote options, and a bonus large enough to fund repairs and upgrades at the cabin that had long been delayed. Even better, I used part of that money to start a micro grant fund through a local nonprofit, helping single women facing housing instability, just like Emily. I named the program Blue Pine Resilience in honor of the lake and the legacy it helped shape. One weekend, as I sat on the dock reviewing grant applications with a hot mug of cider in hand, Emily arrived for a visit. She looked stronger. Her baby was sleeping in a carrier across her chest, and her eyes were clear. "I got the job," she said, smiling. "Remote, marketing assistant. It's not much yet, but it's a start." "It's everything," I said, handing her a grant acceptance letter. "First month's rent for your own place." She blinked back tears. "You believed me when I didn't even believe myself," she whispered. "You believed yourself when it counted," I said. "That's what matters." 3 days later, I received a voicemail from Thomas. His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. "I just wanted to say sorry for everything. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I was trying to build something and went about it the wrong way." I didn't return the call. I forwarded it to my lawyer instead, because I knew the truth now about Thomas, about myself, about what it meant to defend not just property, but purpose. In early November, I hosted my first retreat at the cabin for women entrepreneurs from rural Wisconsin. It was an idea born from a conversation with Elise, transforming a space of healing into one of growth. We lit fires, shared stories, and kayaked at dawn. One of the attendees, a soft spoken woman named Clara, told me, "You know, this place feels like it's been through something, like it knows how to hold pain and peace at the same time." That was it exactly. By the fire pit that evening, I read aloud from Grandpa Lou's journal. "The cabin isn't valuable because of its market price. It's valuable because of the wisdom it holds. The group went quiet, the flames danced, and I felt him there, in every creak of the porch floor, every ripple on the lake. When the retreat ended, several of the women asked if it would become an annual event. I smiled. Yes, I said, it already has. Not long after, I received a letter, this time handwritten, from Tomas. No threats, no demands, just 6 sentences. I see now that I didn't understand what this place meant to you. I was wrong. I've moved on. I won't contact you again. I hope you find peace. I hope the baby does too. It wasn't closure. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. And that night, as snowflakes began dusting the pines, I sat beside the fire, journal in lap, and added my own entry to Grandpa Lou's book. She held the line. She protected what mattered. And in doing so, she became the steward he always believed she could be, because that was the truth. The cabin wasn't just saved. I was. Months passed, and I heard little about Tomas until a headline appeared in my newsfeed that made my heart drop. Former marketing executive faces lawsuit over fraudulent investment scheme. The article featured a photo of Tomas, flanked by lawyers, walking into a federal courthouse in Chicago. Apparently, he had been trying to launch a real estate investment startup using investor funds, but the venture had collapsed amid allegations of misuse and misrepresentation. Lawsuits piled up. Creditors came knocking. It was the financial equivalent of a free fall. Curious, I dug deeper. Public court records revealed he had listed the cabin in promotional materials, calling it a family-owned property soon to be leveraged as a luxury rental. He had pitched it to investors as part of a retreat estate portfolio, claiming future profits from exclusive use rights. My stomach churned. Even after everything, he had continued to use the cabin in his delusions. I forwarded the documents to my lawyer, who filed a cease and desist order along with a formal statement denying any association with his business. That step, I learned later, protected me from being named in any subsequent lawsuits. But the damage for Thomas was swift. Clients fled, his fledgling company dissolved, he was ordered to pay restitution, and by then, there was little left. I learned through Elise that he'd moved into a friend's basement, defaulted on multiple loans, and was being investigated by state authorities. He's ruined, Elise said bluntly during a phone call, and honestly, he did it to himself. Emily confirmed what I suspected. Thomas had not visited their son in over 3 months. No birthday card, no support payment. When her lawyer tried to reach him, Thomas responded with a single line, "I have nothing to give." And yet, despite all this, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a quiet sort of closure. This was the cost of manipulation, entitlement, and betrayal laid bare for everyone to see. He had spent so long pretending to be a man of vision and purpose, only to be undone by his own lies. In a way, I pitied him, but I never forgot the havoc he had caused. One cold evening, I sat on the porch of the cabin, bundled in a thick blanket, watching frost climb the pine trees. Elise joined me, handing me a mug of hot cocoa. "Do you ever think," she asked, "about how different it could have been if he had just asked honestly?" "Every now and then," I said. "But people like Thomas don't ask, they take." Elise nodded. "I'm glad you stood up to him. I'm glad you didn't let him win." Neither did the world, it seemed. In a final blow, I received notice that Thomas had filed for bankruptcy. His credit destroyed, professional licenses revoked, reputation in ruins. His name became a quiet warning in my circles, a parable of what happens when ego overtakes ethics. And as winter snow blanketed the cabin grounds, I knew the storm had passed. Thomas wasn't just out of my life. He was no longer a threat to anyone else either. And that, in the end, was justice. A few weeks later, I received a message from a woman named Rachel, a former colleague of Thomas from his early marketing days. She'd read about the lawsuit and reached out to share her story. Hmm, tried to rope me into that retreat scheme too, she wrote. Said you were family and fully on board. When I asked to talk to you directly, he ghosted me. I'm sorry I didn't warn you earlier. It hit me how many people Thomas had tried to deceive, how many he had manipulated, using my name, my story, my legacy. Emily told me she had started attending a support group for single mothers and women recovering from narcissistic abuse. Hearing other women's stories, she said, made me realize I wasn't crazy. Thomas had a pattern. I was just one of many stops on the way. I drove to see her one Sunday afternoon, bringing baby clothes and a new car seat donated by one of my retreat guests. Still calls sometimes, she admitted, bouncing Noah on her lap. Leaves voicemail saying he's changed. But I don't answer. I've blocked him on everything else. I'm proud of you, I said. She smiled, tired but steady. I'm learning not to confuse pity with permission. That stuck with me. Later that night, I read through more court updates. Thomas had lost his appeal on one of the fraud cases. The judge had written, the defendant knowingly misled investors and misrepresented ownership and usage rights of property that did not belong to him. I printed that quote and placed it in the back of Grandpa Lou's journal. It wasn't just a legal statement. It was a vindication. One afternoon, I received a voicemail from a stranger, one of the investors Thomas had defrauded. I wanted to thank you, the voice said. If you hadn't stood your ground, I might have lost everything. You gave us the proof we needed. I sat quietly, listening twice. Justice, I realized, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet acknowledgments, a slow unweaving of deception, a record corrected. In late winter, Elise and I decided to host a legacy day at the cabin, inviting a few close friends and community members to honor Grandpa Lou's memory. We shared stories, planted a tree near the lake, and unveiled a new sign above the door. Steward's Cabin, established in legacy. As I watched a group of children skipping stones across the frozen lake's edge, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not the absence of conflict, but the result of facing it, surviving it, and building something better in its place. Thomas's downfall hadn't brought me joy, but his absence brought freedom. And that was more than enough. Spring returned to the lake with quiet grace, ice melting into gentle ripples, trees blooming in delicate greens. It had been nearly a year since the storm with Thomas, yet the echoes of that ordeal still shaped my days, not as pain, but as proof. I had survived, rebuilt, and reclaimed something irreplaceable. The cabin was no longer just Grandpa Lou's legacy. It was mine, too, transformed from a place of memory into a living sanctuary for healing, reflection, and new beginnings. After the final lawsuit against Thomas was dismissed, life found a steadier rhythm. I resumed my work with renewed clarity, splitting my time between city projects and long retreats at the cabin. The peace here wasn't accidental. It had been earned, boundary by boundary. One Saturday morning, I hosted a women's retreat themed Sacred Space, Sacred Self. Among the guests was Hazel, radiant and stronger than I'd ever seen her. Noah toddled beside her, giggling as he chased dandelions through the tall grass. I don't know where I'd be without this place, she whispered over herbal tea. You saved us, Brooke. I just offered shelter, I said. You saved yourself. Hazel smiled. You taught me that shelter could be more than a roof. It could be truth, choice, a second chance. That retreat became the first of many. I formalized my vision into a business. The Legacy Haven, a seasonal program for women seeking reconnection after personal upheaval. We focused on rest, storytelling, nature walks, and empowerment workshops. The cabin pulsed with new energy. Gentle, joyful, free. Amanda became a regular visitor, often bringing supplies or leading meditation sessions. I never imagined we'd get here, she said once, watching the sunset from the dock. Not after everything. We earned it, I replied. Step. Our bond, once strained by secrets and silence, had deepened. We spoke often, honestly. When she told me she'd started dating again, slowly, cautiously, I cheered for her. And me? I didn't rush romance. I found satisfaction in solitude, in purpose, in the quiet power of saying no to things that didn't serve my peace. Occasionally, whispers of Tomas surfaced. Someone had seen him tending bar in Chicago or couch surfing through acquaintances. But he no longer held power over my mind. He was a shadow, and I had chosen the light. The biggest shift, I think, wasn't just what I'd reclaimed, but what I'd learned. I learned that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors you lock when someone proves they don't belong inside. I learned that family isn't defined by blood or names, but by respect, honesty, and mutual care. And I learned that sometimes loving yourself means letting go of the stories you once told to keep the peace. Now, each night, I journal beside the fireplace, beneath Grandpa Lou's framed note. Some gifts aren't meant to be divided, their power lies in their wholeness. That legacy is no longer just his, it's mine too. And every woman who finds herself here adds to it. Together, we are not broken. We are boundary keepers, and we are free. A few months later, I received a letter. It had no return address, but bore familiar handwriting. Inside was a short, scribbled note. You won. I hope you're proud. It was unsigned, but I knew it was from Thomas. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt release. He had acknowledged, however bitterly, that the battle was over. I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the paper curl and disintegrate. It wasn't revenge. It was cleansing. A symbolic end to a chapter that had once threatened to redefine my life. In its place, I began a new one. The women who came to the Legacy Haven began sharing their own stories of boundaries reclaimed and peace rediscovered. They planted flowers in Grandpa Lou's old vegetable patch. They built birdhouses. One guest painted a mural inside the guest cabin, a sunrise rising over a lake, with the words, "You are safe here." And they were. There was I. That summer, during the fourth Legacy retreat, Amanda and I led a lakeside gratitude ceremony. We stood hand in hand as women tossed stones into the water, each one bearing a fear, a wound, a name they were ready to release. The ripples spread across the lake like soft thunder. I don't think Grandpa Lou imagined all this, Amanda whispered, tears in her eyes. Maybe he didn't have to, I said. Maybe he just believed we'd find our way. And this was no longer just a cabin, it was a rebirth. And every day I chose to protect it. Every time I said no to what harmed and yes to what healed. I honored that legacy. Not just his, but mine, ours.